The cattle were gone before sunrise. Grace Talmadge discovered it the way she discovered most terrible things, alone, in the gray half-light before the world had fully committed to the day, when she walked out onto the porch of the Talmadge ranch house and looked south toward the grazing pasture and saw nothing but empty grass and trampled mud. Her stomach dropped like a stone into cold water. 53 head of prime Texas Longhorn, every one of them bearing the double T brand she had burned herself after her father died, and they were simply gone. The fence line on the southern edge of the property had been cut cleanly. Not broken. Cut. Someone had planned this. She stood there in the October chill of 1882, her dark hair loose over her shoulders, her boots not yet laced, and she understood in the marrow of her bones exactly who had done this. There was only one man in Caldwell County who had both the motive and the cowardice to move cattle in the night rather than make his claims in the open light of day. Reginald Cook, the man who had been trying to swallow the Talmadge land acre by acre since the moment her father drew his last breath 4 years ago. She did not cry. She had spent all her tears in the first year after her father died, and she had made a silent vow that Reginald Cook would never see her break. She went back inside, laced her boots, loaded her Winchester rifle, and saddled her mare Juniper before the sun had fully crested the ridge to the east. But this is not where the story truly starts. The moment that changed everything, the collision of betrayal and reckoning and something she had not expected, something that arrived wearing worn leather and a reluctant kind of decency, that had begun 3 weeks earlier, when a stranger rode onto her land and asked for work. 3 weeks before the cattle vanished, Grace had been mending the gate post on the north pasture when she heard hoofbeats on the dirt road that wound up from the main trail into Caldwell County. She straightened, wiping dust from her hands onto the front of her work apron, and watched the rider approach. He came in slowly, which she appreciated. Men who came in fast were men who thought they owned the ground they traveled on. This one had a measured pace, like he understood he was approaching something that belonged to someone else. He was not what she expected, which was nothing specific because she had not been expecting anyone at all. He was perhaps 28 or 29, lean but broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had spent years doing hard physical work rather than gymnasium exercise. His hat was a battered brown felt with a crease down the center, and he wore a plain canvas work coat over a collarless shirt. He had a few days of dark stubble and eyes the color of the October sky, a particular shade of gray-blue that changed depending on the angle of the light, which she would not know yet because she had only just met him. He stopped his horse a solid bay gelding about 10 feet from where she stood, and he tipped his hat. "Ma'am, my name is Henry Haskins. I'm looking for work if you have any to give." Grace looked at him steadily. She had learned early that the best way to read a man's character was to be direct and watch how he handled it. "What kind of work do you do, Mr. Haskins?" "Ranch work mostly. I can handle cattle, repair fencing, do carpentry if the need arises. I'm good with horses." He said it plainly without embellishment. She noticed he did not volunteer that he was fast with a gun or good in a fight, which was what most men thought she wanted to hear when they came looking for work on a ranch run by a woman alone. "I had a foreman," she said. "He left in August, said he had a better offer." She paused. "He went to work for Reginald Cook." Something shifted subtly in Henry Haskins's expression. She caught it, filed it away. "I know of Cook," he said, keeping his voice neutral. "Everyone in the county knows of Cook." She set the fence post tool against the rail and looked at him properly. "Where are you coming from, Mr. Haskins?" "San Antonio, most recently. Before that, a spread down near Laredo. References. I can give you names, but they'd take some time to confirm given the distance." She respected that he did not lie about it or bluster. "What do you want for wages?" "Fair wages for fair work. Whatever you've been paying." She told him what she had been paying her last foreman. He nodded without negotiating, which surprised her. Most men tried to get more. She made a decision the way she made most decisions, quickly and with a commitment that she would not second-guess. "I'll give you a month's trial, Mr. Haskins. You'll bunk in the hands' quarters behind the main barn. Meals are at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening. You work sunup to sundown and you answer to me directly. Is that understood?" "Yes, ma'am." "Don't call me ma'am. My name is Grace Talmadge. The ranch is the Talmadge Ranch. I expect you to remember both." He looked at her for a moment, and there was something in his expression she could not immediately categorize. Not admiration exactly, and not challenge. Something quieter and more complicated. "Yes, Miss Talmadge," he said. She had not asked him to call her Miss Talmadge either, but she let it go. The first week, Henry Haskins worked without complaint and without requiring direction more than once. She showed him what needed doing and he did it correctly, which was rarer than it should have been. He repaired 3 sections of damaged fence on the eastern boundary. He cleared a clogged drainage channel near the winter barn that had been flooding the hay storage every time it rained. He doctored a young steer with a hoof infection, with a sure and gentle hand that told her he understood cattle without having to prove it. He did not try to talk to her more than the work required. This, more than anything else, made her begin to trust him slightly. The second week, she caught herself noticing things about him that were not strictly relevant to his employment. The way he handled the horses with a quiet patience that made even the skittish ones settle. The way he ate his supper at the table in the kitchen. She had started feeding him inside rather than making him take a tray to the bunkhouse. A small decision, she told herself, was purely practical, with a particular focused attention, as though he was genuinely grateful for food and did not take it for granted. The way he looked up sometimes from what he was doing and caught her looking, and did not make it strange, just held her gaze for a moment and then returned to his work. She learned things about him in fragments, the way you learn about a person when conversation is a side effect of work rather than the point of it. He had grown up in Tennessee. He had a younger sister who was married and living in Kansas. His father had died when he was 19, and he had been working cattle ranches ever since, working his way west and south and west again. He had never married. He had once ridden for a brand that turned out to be involved in a rustling operation. He had not known it when he signed on, and when he found out, he had left, and that history had made finding good work harder than it should have been, because men talked and stories simplified, and the truth of a thing was always more complicated than the version that traveled. Grace understood about stories that simplified. She had her own. The version that traveled about her was that she was a difficult woman, a proud woman, a woman who should have sold the ranch and taken the sensible path after her father died. The truth was more complicated and more private, and she guarded it the way she guarded everything important, quietly, and with great care. The third week was when things between them shifted in a way that could not be undone. It happened on a Tuesday. She had ridden out to the south pasture to check on the newer cattle she had purchased at the fall auction in Wichita, 53 head that represented nearly every cent of her savings and her entire bet on the future of the ranch. Henry had ridden alongside her, because the south fence had been needing inspection for several days, and it made sense to do both at once. They rode for a while without speaking, which by then felt natural rather than uncomfortable. The October afternoon was clear and cold, the grass going to amber at the tips, the sky that particular deep blue that only happened in the Kansas plains at that time of year. "Cook's men have been riding your fence line," Henry said, not looking at her, keeping his eyes on the south boundary. "I've noticed it 3 times this week. They come in the late afternoon and ride slow like they're assessing something." Grace felt the familiar cold certainty settle into her chest. How many men? 2, usually, sometimes 3. Did they cross the line? Not while I was watching. He paused. "I didn't think it was my place to say anything before I was certain of what I was seeing, but I'm certain now." She looked at him then. He was watching the fence line with a focused, careful attention that she recognized as belonging to someone who had spent years paying attention to things that mattered, who had learned that the details were where danger hid. "Thank you for telling me," she said. He nodded. Then, after a moment, "What does Cook want with your land?" "Everything." She kept her voice even. "My father's land borders his on the south and west. If he absorbs the Talmadge Ranch, he controls water rights to Crane Creek all the way to the county line. That's worth more than the land itself. And you've refused to sell. 3 times in 4 years. Henry was quiet for a moment. That takes something, he said. It was not flattery. It was the kind of statement that acknowledged a real thing directly, and she felt it land somewhere in her chest with an unexpected warmth. It takes stubbornness, she said, with a slight edge of self-deprecation. No, he said quietly. It takes something more than that. They reached the south fence and dismounted to check the posts, and that was when Grace saw the marks in the mud near the corner post hoofprints, many of them, fresh enough to still hold their edges. Not from her cattle, which she knew by the pattern, but from horses. Several horses moving along the outside of her fence line, moving slowly, measuring. She crouched and examined the prints, and Henry came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold afternoon air. He looked at what she was looking at. "They've been counting your cattle through the fence," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she stood. "Cook is planning something. What can you do about it?" She looked south, toward the invisible boundary of Cook's land. "I can be ready," she said. That night, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the lamp between them, Grace told Henry Haskins more than she had told anyone in 4 years. Not everything. She was not built for everything all at once, but enough. She told him about her father, Samuel Talmadge, who had built this ranch from nothing, who had broken ground and strung wire and fought drought and a dozen different kinds of disaster for 30 years, and who had died believing that the land would pass to her and endure. She told him about the first letter from Cook's lawyers, which had arrived while she was still wearing mourning black, which had struck her as an indecency so profound it had steeled her in a way that grief alone might not have. Henry listened without interrupting, without offering opinions she had not asked for. He only asked questions when she paused, and they were good questions, the kind that showed he was actually listening rather than waiting for his turn to speak. "My father always said that land isn't just property," she said. "He said it's a relationship. You take care of it, it takes care of you, and you don't betray relationships." Henry looked at his hands, flat on the table. "My father said something similar." He glanced up. Didn't stop his partner from betraying him anyway. Grace heard something raw and carefully controlled in his voice. "What happened?" "Land dispute. His partner claimed they had a verbal agreement that the land would be divided one way when in fact the agreement had been the other way. The partner had a lawyer and my father didn't. He lost 20 acres he'd broken his back on for 12 years. Henry's voice was steady, but she could hear the effort in the steadiness. "That's when I understood that the law and justice are not always the same thing, and that a man will do terrible things when he believes he can get away with them." She looked at him for a long time. "Is that why you left Laredo? Because you couldn't stand working for men who believed they could get away with things?" He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said, and the simplicity of it told her it was completely true. The space between them felt charged with something she did not have a name for yet, or perhaps she had a name for it but was not ready to use it. She looked down at the lamp flame. "Why did you come here, Henry? To my ranch specifically?" "You said you came from San Antonio. That's a long ride to end up in Caldwell County looking for work when there are a dozen ranches closer." There was a pause. Not a guilty pause, she was a good enough judge of people to know the difference, but a considering one. "I heard about your situation," he said. "There's talk, even as far as San Antonio, about Cook and the Talmadge Ranch. I heard that a woman was holding on to her father's land against a powerful man who was determined to take it." He paused. "I suppose I wanted to work somewhere where I was on the right side of something." She felt the honesty of that land somewhere deep. She also felt something else, a slight wariness, the kind she always felt when something good seemed to arrive without a clear reason. She had learned that lesson thoroughly in the years since her father died. "And what does being on the right side of something look like to you, Mr. Haskins?" "It means being honest," he said. "It means working hard. It means not looking away when someone is being treated unjustly." He met her gaze, And it means telling you something I probably should have told you the day I arrived, which I didn't because I wasn't sure how you'd receive it." She felt herself go very still. "Tell me." Reginald Cook's ranch manager came to San Antonio 2 months ago. He was looking for men to hire on for what he called a special operation. He didn't say exactly what the operation was, but the money he was offering was more than ranch wages, and the way he talked made clear that the work was on the wrong side of the law. Henry kept his gaze on hers. "I turned him down, but I asked enough questions to understand that Cook was planning something against a neighboring property, something that involved cattle." Grace's heart was beating faster, but her face was calm. She had years of practice at keeping her face calm. "And you came here to warn me." "I came here to help if you'd have me." His voice was quiet. "I didn't know how to tell you without sounding like I was trying to position myself as some kind of hero, which I'm not. I just knew what was coming and I couldn't stand by and do nothing." She was quiet for a long moment. She thought about betrayal, about how it wore so many faces, some obvious and some so gentle and reasonable sounding that you only recognized the knife after it was already in. She thought about trust, which she had spent 4 years extending to almost no one. She thought about the look on his face when he talked about his father's lost land, and the careful, deliberate honesty he had just given her, sitting at her kitchen table in the lamplight. "Why didn't you just send me a letter?" she asked, "warning me? Would you have believed a letter from a stranger?" He almost smiled. Just the corner of his mouth. "I thought it would be more useful to be here." She could not argue with that logic. She also noticed, with a private honesty she would not have admitted aloud, that she was very glad he was here. "All right," she said. "Then you know what Cook is planning. Help me figure out how to stop it." They talked until past midnight, the lamp burning low between them, their voices quiet and purposeful. By the time Grace went to bed, she had a plan. Not a perfect plan. Perfect plans, her father used to say, were for people who had the luxury of time, and she had learned that the luxury of time was always running out, but a solid one. And that depended on Henry Haskins being exactly who he seemed to be. She lay awake for a while in the dark, examining that dependence, which felt both necessary and frightening. Then she decided she had made her choice and she would commit to it, because second-guessing in the middle of a plan was worse than making the wrong plan in the first place. She slept. 3 nights later, Cook's men came for the cattle. Grace had suspected they would move on a moonless night, and October provided several of those in a row. She and Henry had spent those nights watching in shifts, taking turns sleeping 2 hours at a time, trading off at the south barn where they had a clear sightline to the pasture. She had told old Pete Garrity, her only remaining hand, to stay clear of the south pasture during those nights and to keep the ranch house shuttered, so that anyone watching from outside would see a property that had gone to sleep. She was in the middle of her watch, just past 3 in the morning, when she heard them. The sound of cattle moving carried differently than the sound of cattle at rest. There was a direction to it, a pressure, a controlled urgency that meant something or someone was pushing them. She was on her feet before the sound fully registered, her Winchester already in her hands. She did not panic. She had known this was coming. She moved to where Henry was sleeping on a blanket behind the south barn and touched his shoulder once, firmly. He came awake instantly, no groggy confusion, just immediate alertness, the kind that belonged to a man who had learned that the difference between sleeping and waking could matter. "They're moving the cattle," she said. He was on his feet with his rifle before she finished the sentence. Here is what Grace Talmadge and Henry Haskins had arranged in the nights leading up to this moment, working together at the kitchen table, with a rough map of the property spread between them. They had known they could not stop Cook's men physically without the risk of violence that would be costly and probably illegal to provoke themselves. They had known that any confrontation in the dark of night would become, in the telling afterward, exactly what Cook wanted: confusion, contested facts, her word against his. What they needed was not to prevent the theft at the moment of its happening. What they needed was the theft to succeed enough to become real, and then to be undone so completely and publicly that Cook had nowhere to hide. So Grace had done something that required tremendous nerve and a very particular kind of cold patience. She had let them take the cattle. Not without witnesses. She and Henry moved through the dark to the eastern ridge which overlooked the southern cut in the fence line, and they counted Cook's men, 4 of them, she could see, with a 5th hanging back on horseback to watch the road. She recognized 2 of the men. One was her former foreman, Dalton Webb, who had left in August to work for Cook. That one stung, but she kept the sting folded away and focused. Henry was beside her, his shoulder touching hers in the cramped space behind the ridge rocks. She could feel the steady, controlled quality of his breathing, and it helped her keep her own breath even. "Dalton Webb," she murmured, barely a sound. "3rd from the left." "I see him," Henry murmured back. They watched the cattle be driven south through the cut fence, through the dark, toward Cook's land. 53 head of longhorn moving in the night, every one of them Grace's entire future. Every one of them branded with the double T. She watched them go and did not make a sound. When the last of Cook's men disappeared into the dark, Henry turned to look at her. She could barely see his face in the dark, but she could feel the question in it, "Are you all right?" She answered it without words, squaring her shoulders and standing up from behind the rocks. "Go," she said quietly. "We have about 3 hours before dawn." Now she could tell the part of the story that required telling quickly. Henry Haskins rode that night. He rode hard and fast to the southwest, taking a route they had mapped in advance that circled wide around Cook's western fence line. He had in his saddlebag a sealed letter addressed to Sheriff Thomas Aldgate of Caldwell County, detailing the theft that had just occurred and requesting the sheriff's presence at the Talmadge ranch by 8 the following morning. He had also in that saddlebag a folded document that Grace had prepared with the help of the county land office, a certified record of the brands on each of her 53 head of cattle, notarized 3 days before by the county recorder, with a sworn statement from Grace herself as to the date of purchase and the registration of the double T brand. It was not enough to just steal the cattle back. Grace needed a reckoning. She needed Reginald Cook to be called to account for this in a place where his money and his lawyers and his practiced look of wounded respectability could not save him. She had thought through every piece of this with Henry over 4 nights of planning, sitting at her kitchen table until the lamp burned low, and in those nights she had begun to understand him as clearly as she had understood anyone in her life. He thought the way she thought practically, several steps ahead, without illusions about what people were capable of. But he also had something she was still working on developing in herself, a patience with imperfection, a willingness to allow for the possibility that things might go wrong without letting that possibility paralyze him. While Henry rode to the sheriff, Grace did the other half of the plan. She saddled Juniper and rode south, but not on the main road. She took the creek path along the eastern edge of Cook's land, a route she had ridden dozens of times as a girl with her father, when the Talmadges and the Cooks had been neighbors rather than enemies. The land changed subtly when she crossed onto Cook's property, better fenced, better watered, the prosperity of a man who had built his empire on shortcuts and the weakness of others rather than on honest labor, though it looked the same from the outside as honest prosperity always did. She found the cattle just before 4 in the morning, penned in a temporary holding area on the northern edge of Cook's main spread, close enough to the boundary that they could be explained away as strays if anyone came looking too soon. Cook's men were loose around the pen, 2 of them on horses, one sitting on a fence post, the rest presumably bedded down nearby. Grace did not ride up to the pen. She circled it in the dark, keeping her distance, making sure she could see the double T brands on the animals nearest the fence she could, clear enough in the starlight. And she made a count, 53, every one of them. Then she did what she had come to do. She dismounted at the downwind edge of a stand of cottonwood trees, pulled a folded paper from inside her coat, and wrote on it by the light of a small lantern she had hooded down to nearly nothing. The writing was brief and precise. When she was done, she folded the paper and tucked it into the split of a notched stick she had prepared, and she rode carefully back the way she had come, and then she looped north and came around to the gate of the temporary pen from the far side, staying low in the saddle and moving Juniper at a walk that made almost no sound. She tied the notched stick with the note to the gate latch of the pen, where it would be impossible to miss at first light. Then she rode home. She reached the Talmadge ranch just as the sky began to separate from black into a deep cold gray in the east. She unsaddled Juniper, went inside, and made coffee. She was on her second cup when Henry Haskins rode back into the yard. He tied his horse and came through the kitchen door and stopped when he saw her sitting at the table. Something in his face shifted, a brief, involuntary release of tension, the expression of a man who had been worried about something and was only now permitting himself to admit it. "The note is on the gate," she told him. He sat down across from her. She poured him coffee without asking. "The sheriff will be here at 8, he said. He wasn't happy about being woken, but he'll come. Did you tell him who sent the men?" "I told him everything you told me to say." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. His hands were very steady, which told her something about the kind of person he was in difficult situations. "Grace." He said her first name for the first time, and she noticed the deliberateness of it, the decision in it. "Are you sure the note is wise?" "If Cook's men find it before sunrise, they'll find it at sunrise," she said, "which is exactly when I want them to find it." He looked at her for a moment. "You wrote something on it that they won't be able to ignore." "I wrote something on it that Reginald Cook will have to read at the county hearing." Henry looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "Who taught you to think like this?" She almost smiled. "My father. He said that when a powerful man expects you to be frightened, the most devastating thing you can do is show him you're not." In the morning's early light, his face was tired but very present, completely focused on her the way it had been from the first day, that quality of his attention that made her feel, in a way she was not accustomed to feeling, genuinely seen. She thought about what it meant that he had ridden through the night for her, not because she had required it, because he had chosen to. She looked at her coffee cup. At 8 o'clock, Sheriff Thomas Aldgate arrived with his deputy, a young man named Carver who was new to the job and still at the stage of taking notes more than acting on them. The sheriff was a broad, practical man in his 50s with a thick gray mustache and the permanent squint of someone who had spent decades reading people in full sun. He had known Grace's father and had a respect for the Talmadge name, which did not translate to favoritism, but did translate to a willingness to hear a fair account of things. Grace told him everything clearly and in order, starting with Cook's men riding her fence line, through the plan she and Henry had devised, to the events of the previous night. Henry confirmed the account where it crossed with his own direct observation. Old Pete Garrity confirmed that he had been told to stay away from the south pasture and had done so. Sheriff Aldgate listened without expression. Then he looked at Grace. "You let them take your cattle." "I let them commit a crime where it could be documented," she said. "And you say you have a witness count of the men involved." "2 witnesses, Henry Haskins and myself." The sheriff looked at Henry with the particular evaluative look of a man in his profession. "You got a good look at these men?" "Yes, sir," Henry said. "I can give you 5 names, 4 certain, 1 probable." The sheriff was quiet for a moment. "And you say you placed a note on the pen where the cattle are being held?" "I did," Grace said. "What does the note say?" Grace looked at him steadily. "It says, 'These 53 head of cattle belong to Grace Talmadge of the Talmadge Ranch, as documented by the County Land Office registration of the Double T brand. They were taken from Talmadge land by your employed hands on the night of October 14th, 1882. I am returning them to you now so that you may present them at the county hearing and explain to Judge Harlan how they came to be on your property bearing my brand.'" She paused. "And then it says, 'I will see you in court, Mr. Cook.'" The sheriff stared at her for a moment. Then his mustache twitched at one end in what might have been, in a more demonstrative man, a smile. "And you mean to drive the cattle back yourself?" "I mean to deliver them to the county seat before the hearing," she said. "With the sheriff's escort, if you're willing, which will ensure that the branded animals are examined by the court before Cook has any opportunity to rebrand or transfer them." There was a pause. Carver had stopped writing and was staring at Grace Talmadge with an expression that was slightly open-mouthed, which she found mildly amusing. "Miss Talmadge," the sheriff said slowly, "I've been in this job for 19 years. I've seen a good many disputes over cattle and land and water rights, and in that time I've seen exactly two people play at this smart." He paused. "One of them was a federal marshal. The other is standing in front of me." Grace said nothing. Compliments, she had learned, were best received quietly and not at all when there was still work to do. "I'll escort you," the sheriff said. "We'll go now before Cook has time to react to that note." They rode. It was one of the stranger sights the county road had seen in recent memory. Sheriff Aldgate and Deputy Carver in front, Grace Talmadge and Henry Haskins on either flank, and 53 head of Double T, branded Longhorn cattle moving down the main road toward the county seat, having been collected from Reginald Cook's temporary pen, with a court order that the sheriff had produced with a speed that suggested he had been waiting for an excuse to produce one for some time. The note on the gate had caused exactly the reaction Grace had anticipated. Cook's men, finding it at first light, had woken Cook himself, who had arrived at the pen in a state of controlled fury, only to discover that the cattle he had stolen were branded so clearly and recently that there was no possible argument about ownership that would hold up for 30 seconds in front of a judge. His first instinct, which several of his men later testified to at the hearing, under oath and under pressure, was to have the cattle rebranded immediately. What stopped him was the arrival of the sheriff's deputy with the court order, who appeared at the gate before Cook had fully finished making that suggestion. The rebranding suggestion, once made, could not be unmade. And Deputy Carver had very good ears and a very good memory for detail, and he had, in fact, continued writing in his notebook all through the sequence of events at Cook's pen that morning. The county hearing took place 4 days later. In those 4 days, Grace and Henry spent their evenings at the kitchen table in a different mode than before. The planning and the urgency were behind them, replaced by something quieter and, in its own way, more frightening. They were two people who had been through something together, and the thing they had been through had stripped away most of the pretense and formality that usually governed the distance between a woman and a man who had just met, and what was left underneath was something. She caught herself thinking about him during the day, which she noted with a precise kind of internal exasperation, because she had a ranch to run and a hearing to prepare for, and she did not have the leisure of thinking about anyone's gray-blue eyes. And yet he caught her thinking about him. She could tell by the way he looked at her, not smug about it, which would have made her close herself off entirely, but something more honest and more tentative than smugness. A kind of quiet acknowledgement, as if to say, "I notice what is happening between us, and I am choosing not to rush it or impose it or pretend it isn't there." On the second evening, he told her something about the Laredo situation that he had not told her before, the full version of it, the part he had compressed and simplified in the earlier telling. The ranch he had ridden for had been running stolen cattle through the back range, rebranding animals they had taken from smaller operations, and then selling them on as their own stock. He had discovered it not by investigation but by accident, finding the wrong pen on the wrong night, and he had confronted the owner, a man named Beaufort, directly. Beaufort had told him that no one would believe a drifting ranch hand over a property owner with 30 years of standing in the community. He had been right. Henry had gone to the local sheriff, and the local sheriff had looked at the situation and decided that Beaufort was a more valuable person to keep satisfied than Henry Haskins. Henry had been told to leave the county quietly, and he had, because staying and fighting would have meant fighting alone with no resources and no backing. "I have thought about that a great many times since," he said. whether I should have stayed and fought differently, whether there was a way I did not see. You were alone, Grace said quietly. There is only so much a person can do alone. He looked at her across the lamp. Yes, he said. And then, after a pause that had a particular weight to it, I was glad this time not to be alone. She felt that in the center of her chest, warm and precise, like a candle flame in a sheltered place. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My father used to say that the hardest thing in the world is to need help and ask for it. Did he find it hard? Terribly, but he did it when he had to." She paused. "I have found it hard too." Henry looked at her steadily. "You didn't exactly ask me to come here," she almost smiled. "No, you came on your own." "I did." There was something in the way he said it, quiet and certain, not as a boast but as a simple statement of a choice freely made. She looked at him for a moment. "Why?" she asked. Not the question she had asked before about why he had come to Caldwell County. A different, smaller, more specific question. "Why did you come here specifically, rather than just stay in San Antonio and write me a letter?" He held her gaze. "Because I had heard about you," he said, "and I wanted to meet a person who would refuse to sell something that mattered 3 times to a man like Cook." He paused. "And because once I met you, I wanted to stay." The silence between them was not an awkward one. It was the kind of silence that had something real inside it, something that neither of them was quite ready to name out loud yet, but both of them could feel with perfect clarity. "We have a hearing in 2 days," Grace said eventually. "We do," he agreed. "We should sleep." "Yes." Neither of them moved for another moment. Then Grace stood, picked up the lamp and bid him good night. As she walked down the hallway to her room, she could feel the warmth of his presence like a second lamp behind her, and she lay awake again for longer than she should have, but this time it was not worry that kept her there. The hearing was held in the county courthouse in Sumner, a building that smelled of timber and old paper, and the particular combination of tobacco and formal occasion that marked public life in that part of Kansas in the 1880s. Judge Eli Harlan presided, a narrow, deliberate man in his 60s, with a reputation for absolutely no patience for legal maneuvering that wasted the court's time. Reginald Cook was already in the room when Grace arrived with Henry and Sheriff Aldgate. Cook was a big man, running to heaviness in his late 50s, with the look of someone who had spent long enough being deferred to that he had forgotten it was not his natural right. He had 2 lawyers beside him and wore a very fine coat with a watch chain across the front of it. And when Grace entered the room, he looked at her with a combination of contempt and barely contained fury that she received without visible reaction. Henry walked beside her and just slightly behind her, and she was aware of his presence with the specific quality of awareness she had developed for him over the past 3 weeks. An awareness that was not dependence, but something adjacent to partnership. Cook's lawyer opened by arguing that the cattle had wandered onto Cook's land of their own volition through a breach in the fence line that he claimed had been on Cook's side of the boundary. He had a surveyor's report he claimed supported this, though the report had been commissioned 2 days before the hearing, which Judge Harlan noted with visible displeasure. Then the sheriff presented his evidence. The 5 names Henry had given him matched in 4 of the 5 cases, with men currently employed on the Cook Ranch. The 5th, it emerged during the proceedings, was Dalton Webb, Grace's former foreman. The rebranding suggestion that Cook had made in front of Deputy Carver was read into the record by Carver, who gave his account in the flat and accurate manner of someone who had written it down immediately after it happened and was simply reporting facts. And then the note was introduced. Judge Harlan read it aloud, as was the practice with documentary evidence in his court. He read it in full, including the final line, "I will see you in court, Mr. Cook," in the completely neutral tone of a man who was professionally committed to not showing emotion in the courtroom, though something around his eyes made Grace suspect that the professional commitment was working harder than usual in this moment. Reginald Cook's face went through several colors as the note was read. When the judge finished reading, He set the paper down and looked over the top of it at Cook with an expression that communicated a great deal about what he thought of the situation without requiring him to express any of it improperly. "Mr. Cook," he said, "this document was placed on the gate of the pen in which 53 head of Double T branded cattle were being held on your property, and those cattle are now in the custody of this court pending this hearing, correct?" Cook's lawyer began to speak. Judge Harlan held up a hand. "I'm asking your client." Cook's jaw was working. "The note was on the gate, yes," he said, in a voice that was doing a great deal of work to stay controlled. "And the cattle were in the pen." "They were." "Bearing the Double T brand registered to Grace Talmadge in the county records." The lawyer tried again. The judge's hand went up again. "Mr. Cook, I can explain," Cook started. "I'm sure you can," Judge Harlan said, in a tone that suggested he was less than certain of this. "Please do so." Cook explained. His explanation involved a story about neighboring herds and confused fence lines, and a good-faith mistake by his employees who had not realized they were moving another party's animals. It was a story built out of the kind of careful vagueness that legal training could produce, and it would have been considerably more impressive if Deputy Carver had not already read into the record the suggestion that the cattle be rebranded before the sheriff's arrival, which was not the action of a man who believed he was dealing with strays. The gallery, which in the manner of small county courthouses in 1882 had filled up with most of the interested parties of the surrounding area, was very quiet during the explanation. The quality of the quiet was the kind that follows something that has been understood by everyone in the room. Judge Harlan ruled. The cattle were returned to Grace Talmadge, all 53 head. Reginald Cook was fined for unlawful taking of branded livestock, which was the formal legal term for what Grace's father would have called plain theft. Dalton Webb, along with 2 of Cook's other identified hands, faced additional proceedings in the criminal court. The surveyor's report commissioned 2 days before the hearing was dismissed as not credible. And the note that Grace had written by lantern light on Cook's own land in the darkest part of the night, that had been read aloud in the county courthouse in front of every prominent rancher and business person and legal officer in Caldwell County. The note became the detail that was talked about afterward in every saloon and general store and kitchen in the county for weeks. Not because of what it said exactly, but because of what it meant. It meant that Grace Talmadge had known what was coming, had let it happen, had outmaneuvered a man with far more money and far more lawyers with nothing but a clear head and a good plan, and the extraordinary kind of nerve that no amount of money could purchase. Reginald Cook left the courthouse without speaking to anyone. His face, which had cycled through colors during the hearing, had settled into something white and set that communicated the depth of the humiliation more accurately than any words could have. He would not look at Grace as he passed. She did not require him to. She was not interested in his humiliation as its own end. She was interested in the security of the Talmadge ranch, and that had been achieved. She was standing on the courthouse steps in the clear October afternoon when Henry came to stand beside her. The crowd was dispersing behind them, and she could hear the voices mixing relief, satisfaction, that particular bright quality that characterized a community that had watched something unjust and had seen it corrected. 53 head of cattle, Henry said, and his voice had something warm and almost amused in it. All the way home. All the way home, she agreed. He was standing beside her on the step, close enough that their arms were nearly touching, and the afternoon sun was warm on the side of her face. She was aware of him in that complete specific way she had been aware of him for the past week, the way that had been building quietly and steadily, and was now at a point where ignoring it required active effort. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. And there it was, clear between them in the plain light of a Kansas October afternoon, something that neither of them had been hiding exactly, but that neither of them had said aloud. "Henry," she said. "Grace," he said. She looked at him for a moment, this man who had ridden through the night for her, who had sat at her kitchen table and listened to her talk about her father, who had thought carefully through every piece of a plan with her without once suggesting that she step back and let him handle it, who had been exactly what he had appeared to be without hidden motive or concealed angle. "I owe you a great deal," she said. "No," he said immediately. "You don't owe me anything. You did this." "We did this," she said with a precision that mattered to her. He was quiet for a moment. "You know," he said, "my month's trial is nearly up." She had not forgotten this. She had not forgotten this for several days, actually. "It is," she said. "I suppose I should know whether you intend to continue my employment." She looked at the street below the courthouse steps, at the October light on the dusty road, at the town that had gathered to witness a reckoning and was now dispersing back into its ordinary afternoon. "I intend to continue your employment," she said, "for as long as you want to stay." There was a pause that she was aware of being meaningful. "And if I wanted to stay for a very long time?" he asked. His voice was quiet and careful, and there was something in it that was more than the question about employment, and both of them knew it. She turned to look at him again. His gray-blue eyes were entirely on her, and she did not look away. "Then we would need to talk about a great many things," she said, "and I think you know that is not what I am saying no to." He looked at her, and the careful restraint in his expression eased into something warmer and more direct, and she felt it like the sun coming out from behind a cloud, which was the kind of thought she would have found embarrassingly florid if she had considered it in the abstract, but which, in the specific concrete moment of standing on courthouse steps in Sumner, Kansas in October of 1882, looking at Henry Haskins looking at her, felt entirely precise. "I know," he said softly. "I'm not in a hurry. That is one of the things I appreciate about you," she said, and turned back toward the street, and she was quite certain that if anyone had been watching closely enough, they might have seen something very much like a smile on the face of Grace Talmadge, which was a thing not many people had occasion to see. The ride back to the ranch was accompanied by Sheriff Aldgate's deputy and a drive of 53 cattle, which did not lend itself to intimate conversation. But Henry rode beside her for most of the journey, and the silence between them had a warmth that was entirely different from the working silence of 3 weeks ago. It was the silence of two people who had said the beginning of something and were allowing it to breathe. Old Pete Garrity met them at the gate with an expression of profound satisfaction, which was as demonstrative as Pete got. The cattle went back into the south pasture. The cut fence had already been repaired. Henry had done it the morning after the theft, while the cattle were still in Cook's pen, because the fence needed to be right before the cattle came home. She stood at the south pasture fence that evening and watched her cattle settle in the late October dusk, and she thought about her father and about the word he had used, relationship. The land, the cattle, the water, the seasons, a relationship you tended every day, not because it was required of you but because it mattered to you. She was aware of Henry standing behind her, a few feet back, giving her the space of the moment, which was something she had not expected to find in another person and found she valued more than she could easily express. She turned. "Henry." He came forward to stand beside her at the fence. "They look well," he said, looking at the cattle. "They do." She paused. "So do you." He looked at her, and the quiet surprise on his face at being looked after, at being noticed, at the small reciprocal gesture of care, made her chest ache with a tenderness she was not entirely prepared for. "Grace," he said, and then he stopped, as if he were choosing his words with the same care he brought to everything else. "You don't have to say it yet," she said gently. "We have time." He looked at her for a moment, and she saw that this, the gift of time, the removal of pressure, the absence of urgency, meant something particular to him, as if he had spent a long time in situations where everything was urgent and nothing was given freely. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. Then on an impulse she trusted. "Have supper with me, just supper. No planning, no strategy, no talking about Cook." Something bright came into his face. "What will we talk about instead?" "Anything else," she said. "Everything else." So they went inside and she cooked supper, a proper supper, with some of the dried herbs she kept from her summer garden and the last of the fall squash from the kitchen garden and good cornbread, and they sat at the kitchen table and talked about everything else. About Tennessee and Kansas, and the particular quality of the light on the plains in autumn versus the mountains in winter. About books, she had kept every book her father owned and had added to them steadily. He had read whenever he could find reading material, which on working ranches was not always often. About her father's hands, the way she remembered them, wide and calloused and certain. About his sister in Kansas, whose name was Margaret and who had 3 children, and who wrote him letters that always ended with the same phrase, "Come visit when you can," which they both understood meant come visit before more time passes than either of us can afford to waste. She laughed at something he said, a genuine, unguarded laugh, and she caught the expression on his face when she laughed, which was the expression of someone witnessing something they had not quite dared to hope for, and she felt warmth spread all through her in a way that was both utterly simple and entirely unprecedented. Afterward, when he had thanked her for supper and stood to go, he paused at the kitchen door. "I want to say one thing," he said, "even though you gave me permission to wait." She looked at him. "Say it. I came to Caldwell County because I heard about the situation, but I stayed because of you. And I am going to stay for as long as you'll have me, not because of the work." He held her gaze steadily. "I wanted you to know that the rest can wait." She was quiet for a moment, holding that. Then she said, "I know, Henry, I've known for a little while." She paused. "I wanted you to know that I'm glad you said it anyway." He nodded. A small, private smile he put on his hat. "Good night, Grace." "Good night, Henry." She listened to his boots on the porch steps, and then the sound of his footsteps across the yard to the bunkhouse, and she sat alone at the kitchen table for a long moment in the warmth of the lamp, and she allowed herself, quietly and privately, to feel something she had not felt in 4 years, the particular quality of happiness that is not loud but that is deep. November came in cold and hard, the way November did in Kansas, with a wind from the northwest that had no mercy in it and frosts that killed off the last of the season's work. It was the kind of weather that forced people indoors together, and indoors together meant conversation and proximity, and the gradual dissolution of whatever remaining formality was between them. They spent the evenings reading. She had a particular fondness for history, and he turned out to be interested in it as well, and they fell into the habit of trading books back and forth with the kind of casual intimacy that suggested comfort and talking, and sometimes just sitting in the same room in a silence that had become entirely comfortable and entirely its own thing. One evening in mid-November, he told her about the loneliness. Not in a maudlin way, he was not built for self-pity any more than she was, but directly and honestly, the way he did everything. He said that the years of moving from ranch to ranch, of never having a place that was properly his, of always being on the edge of communities rather than inside them, had a particular weight to it that was different from the ordinary loneliness of an isolated life. "It is the loneliness of not belonging anywhere," he said. "Not to a land, not to a person." She set her book down and looked at him. "I know that loneliness," she said. "It is different from being alone. I have been alone here for 4 years, and that is manageable. But there were times when I felt that I did not belong to anyone's story but my own, and my own story was running very thin." She paused. "Until recently." He looked at her. His eyes were very warm in the lamplight. "Until recently," he agreed. The kiss happened 3 evenings later, and it happened the way things did between people who had been moving toward each other honestly and slowly, without dramatic event or external catalyst, simply as the natural arrival of something that had been building and was now ready. She had been returning a book to the shelf and he had been beside her, and she turned and he was closer than she had realized, and for a moment they both simply stopped, looking at each other in the way that required nothing except what was already true. He lifted his hand and very gently tucked a strand of hair back from her face, a gesture so careful and so tender that it undid something in her that she had not known was wound tight. She turned her face slightly into his hand, and then he kissed her softly, briefly, with a gentleness that held no demand. And she kissed him back, and it was exactly what it should be. Simple and certain and warm, without performance or desperation, just the meeting of two people who had found each other in a difficult world and had decided to stay. He pulled back just enough to look at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment because there was nothing that needed saying. "All right," she said eventually, which made him laugh, a real, unguarded laugh that she had been wanting to hear for weeks. "All right," he agreed. December brought snow and the particular quiet of a ranch in winter. Henry stayed. The question of his employment had long since shifted to something that neither of them addressed directly as employment any longer, because the nature of what he was doing, working alongside her, planning with her, looking after the land as if it mattered to him personally, which it clearly did, had moved past the definition of wages and into the territory of investment. In January, on a frozen afternoon when they were repairing the roof of the winter barn together, she said, "I want to keep this ranch. I want to grow it. I want it to be something my father would recognize as the thing he built, even if it has changed." She was handing him a new shingle and looking up at him where he was balanced on the roof edge. "I want you to know what I am working toward." He took the shingle and looked down at her. "I want to help build it," he said simply. She nodded. "I know you do." She paused, a shingle in each hand, cold air turning her breath to mist. "Henry," I think she stopped. Measured what she wanted to say against what was true, the way she always did. "I think I am in love with you," she said, "and that is not a small thing for me to say." He was very still on the roof for a moment. Then he climbed down carefully, and when he was on the ground in front of her, he took both her hands, shingles and all, and held them. His hands were warm even through the cold air. "It is not a small thing for me either," he said. "And I love you, Grace. I have since, I don't know exactly when. Perhaps the first time you told me to stop calling you ma'am." She laughed, and it went up into the cold winter air, bright and clear, and he laughed too. And he leaned in and kissed her in the winter cold with the ranch around them, and the snow on the pasture and the 53 head of longhorn cattle warm in the winter barn, and it was as complete and sure a moment as she had ever lived. He proposed to her in February on a Sunday in the kitchen, which was exactly where she would have wanted it. Not a dramatic setting, not a formal occasion, just the two of them at the kitchen table with the morning coffee, and him looking at her with those gray-blue eyes that she had learned every variation of by then, and saying, "Grace, I want to marry you if you're willing. I want this to be my home. I want to build this life with you." She looked at him for a long, clear moment. She thought about her father, who had built this place and left it to her. She thought about the 4 years of holding on. She thought about the night they had watched 53 cattle move through a cut fence in the dark, shoulder to shoulder, neither of them running. She thought about the note on the gate and the hearing, and the moment on the courthouse steps, and every evening at the kitchen table, and every morning on the ranch, and the long January afternoon repairing the barn roof, and that first careful kiss. "Yes," she said, "I'm willing." They were married in April, when the Kansas spring had made everything new and possible again. The ceremony was in the small Methodist church in Sumner, with Sheriff Aldgate as a witness and Pete Garrity looking more demonstratively pleased than anyone had ever seen him. Henry's sister Margaret had made the journey from Kansas with her husband and children, and the presence of his family, people who belonged to him, people who received Grace with warmth and without reservations, filled something in both of them that had been quietly empty. Grace wore her mother's pearl earrings, which she had kept in a box in her dresser for 4 years, waiting for an occasion that felt worthy of them. This felt worthy. Henry Haskins said his vows with the same quality of careful directness he brought to everything, not recited, but meant. And when they were said, and when she had said her own, and when the minister had pronounced them married, Henry looked at her with an expression she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. completely and peacefully certain, as if all the moving around had been leading here, to this church in Kansas, to this woman. They rode back to the ranch afterward, which was now their ranch, the Talmadge Haskins Ranch, though they kept the Talmadge name first for her father's sake, in the spring afternoon, and the land looked as it had always looked and also completely different, the way the same land can look before and after something fundamental has changed. Reginald Cook, it should be said, did not recover his standing in the county after the hearing. The note, read aloud in the courthouse by Judge Harlan, had a long afterlife in the telling and retelling of the county's social life, and Cook was never again quite the man people crossed the street to defer to. He did not approach the Talmadge land again. He sold off his northern holdings the following year and retreated to the core of his operation, which without the Talmadge water rights was considerably less impressive than he had planned. He became, in the end, a smaller man than he had intended to be, which was perhaps a more appropriate punishment than any the law could have devised. Dalton Webb, Grace's former foreman, served time and then left the county entirely. The other hands involved in the theft accepted reduced settlements in exchange for their testimony against Cook, which supplied the evidentiary foundation for the fines and the ongoing legal consequences. Justice, as Henry had noted, was not always the same as the law, but in this particular instance, they had arrived at something close enough. The spring of 1883 was a good one for the Talmadge Haskins Ranch. The cattle were healthy. The winter barn roof held through the February ice. Henry had ideas about expanding the operation, adding horses to the cattle operation, which he knew well from his years on various spreads. And Grace had the business sense to evaluate which ideas were sound and the trust to implement them. They argued sometimes, which they both appreciated, because neither of them was built for easy agreement, and the arguments were always about real things and resolved with the same directness that governed everything between them. She was expecting their first child by midsummer, which she told him on a hot July morning while they were both looking at the south pasture fence that had been cut the previous October. She told him plainly, the way she did everything. He went very still, the way he always did when something affected him deeply, and then he turned to look at her with an expression that was beyond words, so he did not try to use them for a moment. Then he said, "Are you well?" "Perfectly well," she said. He took her hand, standing at the south fence on a July morning, and held it, not dramatically, just steadily. "Good," he said, and then, after a moment, "Everything is good." Their son was born in late January of 1884 in the middle of a Kansas winter storm, delivered by the doctor from Sumner who had driven through 2 inches of new snow to get there. They named him Samuel for her father. Samuel Talmadge Haskins, which carried both names and therefore both stories. Henry sat with Grace through the labor with a patience and steadiness that she would not have been surprised by, but that the doctor noted aloud. He said he had attended many births in his career, and rarely seen a husband hold his composure so completely. Grace, whose own composure was being tested by the more demanding requirements of childbirth, found that Henry's presence did what it had always done. It steadied her without diminishing her. Samuel arrived healthy and loud into the January night, and when Henry held him for the first time, Grace watched his face go through something she had no language for, a kind of pure, arriving love that was entirely different from any other expression she had seen on him, and she had catalogued a great many of them. "Hello, Samuel," Henry said quietly, looking down at his son. "I'm your father." A pause. "That will take some getting used to." Grace laughed from the bed, tired and warm and more deeply happy than she had a frame of reference for. He looked up at her, and the love between them in that cold January room was palpable and solid, the realest thing in the room. The years that followed were the years of building, the ordinary extraordinary work of building a life and a family and a working operation in a place that required daily investment, and returned it with the specific satisfaction of things that endure. They had a second child 3 years after Samuel, a daughter, whom they named Ellen for Henry's mother, who had died before he could bring his family here. Ellen had her father's gray-blue eyes and her mother's stubborn precision, which Henry observed with a private amusement that never entirely left him. The ranch grew. Not extravagantly, not beyond their ability to manage well, but steadily, the way Grace's father had built it, with care and commitment and a clear understanding of what they were tending. Henry's horse operation became a secondary income that in good years rivaled the cattle. He developed a particular expertise with working horses training, breeding, selling to ranches and military posts, and Grace managed the accounts and the negotiations with the focused intelligence she brought to everything. Pete Garrity stayed on until he was too old to work, and they kept him on salary after that because it was right, which he accepted with the particular dignity of a man who understood the difference between charity and respect. Henry's sister Margaret visited twice more in those years, and the families became genuinely close, which filled a loneliness in Henry that Grace was glad to see eased. She had always understood, without being told, that the years of moving around had cost him in ways that went beyond the obvious, and she felt the specific quiet satisfaction of watching those costs be paid back by the ordinary richness of a rooted life. Samuel grew into a boy who had his mother's directness and his father's patience, which was a combination that Grace suspected would serve him well in the world. She told him the story of the cattle and the note and the hearing when he was old enough to understand it 9 or 10, sitting on the porch after supper on a summer evening, and he listened with the serious attention of a child who recognized that he was being told something true. "Did you know it would work?" he asked, when she had finished. She considered the question honestly. "I knew it was the best plan I had," she said. "That is not quite the same as knowing it would work." He thought about this. "Did you do it alone?" "No," she said, looking at Henry where he sat across the porch, his hat pushed back, watching them. "Your father helped me think it through, and he rode through the night to get the sheriff." Samuel looked at his father. "Why did you help her?" he asked with the directness of a child who had learned directness at home. Henry looked at their son for a moment. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said, "and because she was worth helping." He paused. "I suppose by that point I had also figured out that I was in love with her, but mostly the first reason." Grace met his eyes across the porch and felt the warm, settled rightness of everything, the cattle in the south pasture, the sound of Ellen's laughter somewhere inside the house, the October evening closing in gold and cool over their land, their home. Reginald Cook died in 1890 of a heart condition, according to the county paper. His land was sold by his heirs and divided among several operations. The Talmadge Haskins ranch acquired 12 acres of the northern boundary, which had always been a useful buffer, and they acquired it through a perfectly legal negotiated purchase at fair price, which Grace noted with a dry private satisfaction as a more fitting conclusion than anything more dramatic would have been. The south pasture fence was never cut again. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Henry found Grace in the evening at the kitchen table, where else writing something in the account book. He set a small package beside her hand. She looked up. He sat down across from her, where he had sat 10 years earlier on the night they had talked until the lamp burned low and the plan had taken shape between them. She opened the package. It was a new journal, bound in brown leather with her name stamped on the cover in gold letters, Grace Talmadge Haskins, both names, her father's and his and her own. "I thought you might want to start writing things down," he said. "The way things happened, the history of this place." He paused. "Samuel will want to know all of it someday. Ellen, too." She held the journal in both hands and looked at it and then looked at him. The lamp was between them as it always was, and his face was the face she had been looking at across this table for 10 years, and she had not stopped finding it the truest thing she knew. "Henry," she said. "Grace," he said, with the warmth that was entirely natural now, entirely theirs. "Thank you," she said, "for the journal, for all of it. For the bay gelding coming slowly up the road in October 12 years ago, for the month's trial that had become a life, for the night ride to the sheriff, for sitting at this table through all the lamplit evenings, for being exactly who he appeared to be every single day, which was the rarest and most sustaining thing one person could offer another. "Thank you," he said back, which meant what it meant. She opened the journal to the first page and picked up her pen. He waited, comfortable, the lamp between them. She wrote at the top of the first clean page, "This is the history of the Talmadge Haskins ranch and of the people who built it." Then she looked up. "I don't know how to start." Henry thought about it, a small, certain smile. "Start with the cattle," he said, "and the note." She laughed, low and warm, in the kitchen of the ranch that her father had built and that she had held, and that they had grown together into something that would last beyond both of them into the futures of their children and their children's children. Outside, the Kansas evening settled over the south pasture, and the winter barn, and the good fences, and the land that belonged to no one but all of them, and the lamp burned steadily on the table, and Grace Talmadge Haskins put her pen to paper and began. Samuel would find the journal decades later, in a cedar chest in the main bedroom, after both of his parents had lived full and long and well-accounted lives on the land they had tended together. He would read it from the first page to the last, and he would find, midway through the very first entry, written in his mother's precise and clear hand, the text of the note she had pinned to Reginald Cook's gate on a cold October night in 1882. He would read it twice, and then he would smile the way his father had always smiled, quietly, and with a certainty that held something private and true inside it. And he would understand that the story of his parents was a love story before it was anything else, and a brave one, and that those two things had never been in conflict. He would take the journal to the porch where he had sat as a boy and heard the story the first time, and he would read it in the afternoon light. And when Ellen came to find him there, she would sit beside him and they would read it together. The two of them in the home their parents had made out of will and honesty, and a plan laid out at a kitchen table between two people who had found each other in a difficult world and had chosen, every single day, to stay. And the south pasture fence stood straight and whole, and the Double T brand endured on the land, and the cattle grazed in the October light the way they had always grazed, and the ranch was home.